Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The night was thick with the scent of damp earth as rain drizzled lightly against the rusted rooftop of a small bungalow in the outskirts of town. Inside, the dim glow of a single light bulb cast soft shadows along the cracked walls of the modest living room, where a woman sat hunched over a sewing machine. Mrs. Agnes worked late into the night, her hands moving rhythmically, stitching fabric together with a precision that came from years of necessity rather than passion. Her tired eyes, ringed with the weight of sacrifice, flickered toward the small wall clock, ticking away above the wooden shelf, and she let out a weary sigh. It was almost midnight, and yet she was still working, not for herself, but for her son, Emmanuel, the only son she had vowed to give the world. A smile played on her lips as she thought of him, a boy she had always seen as a gift from God, the one she had promised to protect at all costs. Since the day she buried her husband, she had made a silent oath to ensure Emmanuel never lacked anything, even if it meant shielding him from the harshness of life. She had 3 other children, but none held the same place in her heart as he did. He was special, different. While the others were taught to endure, Emmanuel was meant to enjoy. He was the one who deserved more, the one she refused to let suffer, no matter the cost. From the moment he could walk, Emmanuel understood the power he had over his mother. It started small. A toy denied to his sisters was handed to him without hesitation. A punishment given to the others conveniently skipped when it came to him. He learned that tears worked wonders, that silence was a tool, and that defiance could be excused with a well-timed pout. What began as simple indulgences grew into something more. By the time he turned 10, he had developed a sharp tongue and an arrogance that should have been alarming, but instead it was brushed off as confidence. His siblings resented him for it, but he never cared. He had learned early on that consequences did not exist for him. If he broke a neighbor's window, his mother paid for it without reprimand. If he refused to do chores, she would do them herself rather than hear him complain. Teachers at school reported his misbehavior, but she defended him fiercely, convinced the world simply did not understand her son the way she did. To her, he was not a spoiled child. He was just bold, just different, just misunderstood. He grew up without knowing the weight of responsibility, without ever being told no in a way that mattered. And so, he carried himself through life with the belief that he could have anything, be anything, simply because his mother had made it so. As the years stretched on, Emmanuel's behavior worsened, but Mrs. Agnes remained blind to it, or perhaps she simply chose not to see. By the time he was a teenager, he had mastered the art of manipulation. He knew exactly how to make his mother feel guilty, how to turn her love into a weapon that bent her to his will. If she ever hesitated to grant his wishes, he reminded her of all she had promised him, of the life she swore he would never suffer through. And she always caved. His sisters, now old enough to see the cracks in their mother's logic, tried to warn her. They told her she was raising a boy who had no sense of right or wrong, a boy who would one day bring her pain. But their words fell on deaf ears. "He's just a boy," she would say. "He will change when he grows older." But Emmanuel never did. If anything, he grew bolder. He came home late, skipped school when he pleased, and spent money recklessly, knowing there would always be more. The first time he got into a fight at school, his mother dismissed it. The second time, she made excuses. By the third, the school threatened to expel him, but she pleaded on his behalf, promising them he would do better. He never did. But through it all, she remained devoted, believing that as long as she could provide for him, nothing else mattered. What she didn't know was that the boy she loved so blindly was already lost, already slipping away into a world she could no longer protect him from. The late afternoon sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood where children played with sticks and old bicycle tires, their laughter ringing through the dusty streets. Emmanuel, however, was not among them. He was inside, sprawled across the worn-out sofa, a phone pressed to his ear as he demanded money from his mother with an air of entitlement that had become second nature. His voice carried through the small house, a mixture of impatience and irritation. "I told you I need it today, Mama." "Why are you acting like you don't have it?" he snapped, ignoring the disapproving glances from his sisters, who sat quietly in the corner, pretending not to listen. His mother, standing by the kitchen sink, wiped her hands on her faded wrapper and sighed. "Emmanuel, I just gave you money 2 days ago," she said carefully, her voice carrying both exhaustion and caution, as if she already knew the argument that would follow. Emmanuel scoffed, rolling his eyes. "And so? What's 2 days? You know things are expensive now." His words carried no gratitude, no consideration, just the certainty that he would get his way as he always had. His sisters exchanged a knowing glance, but said nothing. They had long learned that speaking up was pointless. Their mother would give in. She always did. And just as expected, after a few more minutes of back and forth, she sighed and nodded. "I will send it to you before evening." A smirk tugged at Emmanuel's lips as he muttered a half-hearted thank you before returning to his phone, already moving on to something else, as if the conversation had never happened. By the time Emmanuel reached his final year of secondary school, his sense of entitlement had grown into something far more dangerous, a belief that rules, boundaries, and consequences simply did not apply to him. He had become the kind of boy teachers dreaded and peers envied, a reckless spirit with too much confidence and no discipline to ground him. He skipped classes whenever he pleased, choosing instead to roam the streets with boys who shared his careless attitude. They lingered outside betting shops, wasting hours placing bets with the money their parents struggled to send them. When he did show up at school, he was either late or disruptive, lounging in his chair with an air of boredom, barely paying attention to the lessons. His teachers had long given up trying to correct him. Warnings had been ignored. Punishments were meaningless when his mother always found a way to shield him. Even when he was caught cheating during an exam, she had marched into the principal's office with tears in her eyes, insisting that her son was being unfairly targeted. The school had relented, unwilling to argue with a mother so fiercely protective of her child, but it was clear to everyone that Emmanuel was headed down a dangerous path. His sisters, now old enough to recognize the weight of their mother's mistakes, tried once more to intervene. "Mama, you are not helping him," one of them pleaded one evening as they all sat for dinner. "You think you are showing him love, but you are destroying him." But Mrs. Agnes had simply shaken her head, her eyes filled with the kind of unwavering devotion that refused to see reason. "You don't understand," she murmured. "He is my son, my only son. I have to make sure he has everything he needs." And with that, the conversation was over. The night before his final exams, while other students buried themselves in textbooks, desperate to secure their future, Emmanuel was nowhere near a book. He was outside, leaning against a parked motorcycle, laughing loudly with a group of boys as they passed around a cheap bottle of liquor. He had never truly feared failure because failure had never been real to him. It had always been something that happened to other people, those without mothers like his, those who did not have someone willing to move mountains for them. So when his results came out weeks later, and he barely scraped by, he did not panic. He did not even care. All that mattered was that his mother, as always, was there to celebrate him, to remind him that he was destined for great things. And so, when he received his university admission, there was no reflection, no realization of how unprepared he was for what lay ahead. There was only excitement, the thrill of something new, a bigger world where he could do as he pleased, free from the watchful eyes of his sisters and the quiet judgment of those who saw through the illusion his mother had built around him. As the family prepared for his departure, his sisters remained silent, exchanging wary glances, knowing deep down that nothing had changed. Their mother, however, was blinded by pride, boasting to neighbors about how her son was going to the university, convinced that this was the turning point she had always hoped for. She never questioned whether he was ready, never wondered if the years of unchecked indulgence had prepared him for the independence that lay ahead. And so, when the day finally came for Emmanuel to leave, she packed his bags with love, pressed a bundle of money into his hands, and sent him off with a heart full of hope, never realizing that she was not sending her son toward a future of success, but toward his own destruction. The journey to university was supposed to mark a new beginning, a fresh start in a world filled with endless possibilities. As the bus rumbled down the long, dusty highway, Emmanuel leaned back in his seat, earphones plugged in, barely paying attention to the blur of trees and buildings rushing past the window. He wasn't nervous or anxious like the other students on board, many of whom clutched their admission letters tightly, their eyes filled with determination and quiet fear. He had none of that. Instead, he was relaxed, scrolling through his phone, already making plans for the kind of life he wanted to live on campus. To him, university wasn't about books, lectures, or exams. It was about freedom, a chance to finally live without restrictions, without the nagging voices of his sisters or the watchful gaze of his neighbors. His mother had sent him off with enough money to last a semester, believing he would spend it wisely, but even before reaching his destination, he had already begun spending carelessly. At a stop along the way, while others stretched their legs or bought cheap snacks, he wandered into a small shop and emerged minutes later with a brand-new wristwatch and an expensive pair of sneakers. By the time he arrived at the school gate, half his money was already gone, but he didn't care. After all, there would always be more. His mother had never let him lack before, and he had no reason to believe she would start now. Settling into university life, Emmanuel quickly realized that the world was far larger than the small neighborhood he had left behind. Here, no one cared about his mother's love or his sister's warnings. People only respected power, money, and influence. Within days, he found himself drawn to a particular group of students, boys who dressed well, spoke confidently, and moved with an air of untouchability. They had cars, expensive gadgets, and the kind of reckless charm that made them the center of attention wherever they went. It wasn't long before he began imitating them, learning their habits, adopting their mannerisms. He stopped attending lectures almost immediately, seeing no reason to sit through boring classes when there were better things to do. Instead, he spent his days lounging in off-campus apartments, drinking, smoking, and listening to stories about the secret societies that controlled the school. The idea fascinated him. He had always believed himself to be different, destined for a life above ordinary men, and here was the perfect opportunity to prove it. His initiation into the fraternity was brutal, nights of beatings, sleepless rituals, and silent obedience, but he endured it all, fueled by the promise of power and protection. By the time it was over, he had been reborn, no longer just another student, but a part of something bigger, something darker, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly invincible. With his newfound status came a lifestyle that demanded constant money, and Emmanuel adapted quickly. He developed expensive tastes, buying clothes, alcohol, and gadgets without hesitation. The money his mother sent, once enough to sustain him, now disappeared within days, but he never worried. Whenever he ran out, he simply called home, spinning lies about tuition fees, class projects, and unexpected school expenses, and each time his mother, ever trusting, sent more. She never questioned his words, never suspected that the son she adored was living a life completely detached from the one she imagined. While his classmates studied late into the night, preparing for exams, Emmanuel was out drinking, partying, and embracing the reckless world he had thrown himself into. His lecturers barely knew his name. His books gathered dust under his bed, and as the semesters slipped by, he convinced himself that none of it mattered. He had the connections, the influence, and the confidence to make it through university without ever opening a textbook, but what he failed to realize was that time had no loyalty. The 4 years he treated like an endless playground were vanishing, and soon The weight of his choices would come crashing down on him in ways he never imagined. The night air was thick with the scent of burning tobacco and stale alcohol as Emmanuel sat on the edge of a plastic chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the cold glass bottle in his hand. The dimly lit room was filled with laughter, music, and the sharp clinking of shot glasses as his new brothers celebrated yet another successful night of revelry. The apartment, far from the cramped hostels most students endured, was a sanctuary for men like him, those who had sworn loyalty to something greater, something stronger. The walls, once white, were now stained with years of cigarette smoke and the careless remnants of drunken nights. In the corner, a group of boys argued over a deck of playing cards, their voices rising above the muffled sound of Afrobeat music, playing from a speaker that had seen better days. Emmanuel exhaled slowly, watching the thick swirl of smoke escape his lips, his mind hazy from the mixture of alcohol and weed. This was his world now, a place where rules did not exist, where fear was a foreign concept. He had seen things, done things, that would have once made him shudder, but now they barely stirred anything in him. He had lost count of how many fights he had been in, how many nights had ended in chaos. The first time he had watched someone bleed, something in him had changed. The fear, the hesitation, had vanished, replaced by a quiet numbness that made it easier to keep going. The transformation had been gradual, creeping into him like a slow-moving shadow, darkening every part of who he once was. At first, it was just about belonging, about proving himself to the men who had accepted him into their circle. He had thought it was enough to wear the colors, to speak the coded language, to walk with the confidence that came with knowing he had people who would stand by him no matter what. But loyalty in the brotherhood came with a price, and the deeper he went, the higher the cost. It started with small tasks, delivering packages, keeping watch during meetings, showing up when needed. But then came the real tests. The first time he was asked to rough someone up, he hesitated, his fingers twitching as he looked at the trembling boy who had crossed the wrong person. But one look at the expectant faces around him, the quiet smirks of those who had already proven themselves, and he knew there was no turning back. His fists met flesh, and with each hit, something inside him cracked open, unleashing a side of him he never knew existed. After that, it became easier. He learned to ignore the guilt, to drown the small voice in his head that whispered warnings he no longer cared to hear. Nights blurred into days, and soon, he wasn't just taking orders, he was giving them. He had power now, real power, the kind that made people lower their gaze when he walked past, the kind that made even lecturers tread carefully around him. He didn't need books or exams. He had influence, and in his mind, that was all that mattered. But power was a dangerous thing, a beast that demanded more the longer it was fed. The thrill of control, the rush of living on the edge, had blinded him to the slow unraveling of everything around him. His money ran out faster than ever, and his mother, though still sending him whatever he asked for, had begun to question the never-ending expenses. His lies became more elaborate, more desperate, but she remained trusting, still believing that her son was focused on building a future. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. His grades, which had never been a priority, were now beyond saving. He hadn't stepped into a lecture hall in months, hadn't written an exam in even longer. The school had issued warnings, but warnings meant nothing to a man who believed himself untouchable. Even his cult brothers had begun to notice his recklessness, the way he spent without thinking, the way he provoked fights without reason. The same group that had once welcomed him with open arms was beginning to see him as a liability. But Emmanuel was too far gone to notice, too drunk on the illusion of his own invincibility. And so he carried on, unaware that he was running straight toward a fall so steep there would be no coming back. The first real sign that things were falling apart came in the form of a thin white envelope slid under his door late one evening. Emmanuel had been half asleep, the remnants of a hangover dulling his senses, when he noticed it lying just inside his room. The sight of official school stationery sent a strange chill through him, but he brushed it off, tearing the envelope open with little concern. The letter inside was brief but heavy, a formal notice from the university, warning him of his academic standing. His name had been flagged for non-attendance, and if he failed to meet with his faculty head within the next week, he risked suspension. Emmanuel stared at the words for a long time, his mind struggling to process the reality of them. It wasn't the first time he had received warnings, but something about this one felt different, final. A flicker of unease twisted in his gut, but he shoved it down, tossing the letter onto his cluttered desk. There were bigger things to worry about. Exams were coming, but he had no intention of sitting for them. His mind was occupied with other matters, the growing tension within the fraternity, the whispers that some members were being targeted by rival groups. The school, his grades, his future, they all seemed distant, unimportant. The thought of failing, of getting expelled, should have terrified him, but it didn't. He had spent years convincing himself that none of it mattered, that there were other ways to secure power, success, and respect. He had no regrets. Or, at least, that's what he told himself. But even as he tried to drown out the reality of his situation, the consequences of his choices began creeping closer. Money, which had once flowed so easily, had become a problem. His mother, though still sending him whatever she could, had begun questioning his constant financial demands. The excuses he had once spun so effortlessly were beginning to wear thin. "Emmanuel, what exactly are you spending all this money on?" she had asked during their last phone call, her voice lined with suspicion for the first time. He had scoffed, brushing her off with a lie about unexpected school fees, but even he could hear the doubt in her silence. Worse still, his position in the fraternity was no longer as secure as it once was. He had been reckless, spending too much, talking too loud, making enemies without care. There had been an incident the week before, a fight at a bar that had escalated too quickly. A bottle had been broken, blood had been spilled, and though Emmanuel had walked away with nothing but a scratch, the weight of it lingered. The higher-ups had warned him, told him to lay low, to stop drawing attention. But Emmanuel had never been good at listening. He thrived on the chaos, on the rush of feeling untouchable. He believed himself above consequence, beyond failure. Yet, despite his bravado, the walls were closing in. His name was now being whispered in the wrong circles, and for the first time, he could feel the shift, the slow but certain unraveling of everything he had built. Then came the night that changed everything. It had started like any other, a gathering at one of the off-campus apartments, drinks flowing, music blaring. But there was tension in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Emmanuel sensed it, but ignored it, choosing instead to lose himself in the intoxication of the moment. It wasn't until much later, when the music had faded and only a handful of them remained, that the reality of his situation struck. One of the older members, a man known for his silence and sharp eyes, pulled him aside. "You've been making too many mistakes," he said, his tone unreadable. "People are watching you, and not in a good way." Emmanuel laughed it off, but the man didn't smile. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. You either fix yourself, or you become a problem we have to fix." The words sent a cold, unfamiliar fear through Emmanuel's chest. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long forgotten: vulnerability. The illusion he had crafted so carefully was beginning to crack, and beneath it, he saw the truth he had been avoiding. He was not invincible. He was not above consequence, and soon he would have to face everything he had tried so hard to escape. The days following the warning felt different. Emmanuel tried to convince himself that nothing had changed, that the weight pressing down on his chest was just paranoia. But deep inside, he knew better. The atmosphere around him had shifted in ways he couldn't ignore. The looks he once received from his fraternity brothers, nods of approval, smirks of admiration, had become measured, cautious. Conversation stopped when he walked into a room. and when they resumed, they felt forced, as if everyone was waiting to see what he would do next. Even his closest allies had begun to pull away, answering his calls less frequently, offering half-hearted responses when he spoke. It wasn't immediate, but the slow withdrawal was unmistakable. And yet Emmanuel, stubborn as always, refused to acknowledge the warning signs. Instead of laying low, he doubled down on his reckless lifestyle, drinking harder, spending faster, picking fights he had no business starting. He was desperate to prove, to himself and to everyone else, that he was still in control, still the same fearless boy who had walked into university believing the world owed him something. But deep inside, the certainty that had once fueled him was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. He started to notice things he had ignored before, the way whispers followed him, the way certain doors, once always open to him, were now closed. For the first time, it occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, he had pushed too far, too fast. And once that thought took root, it refused to leave. Then came the realization that shook him to his core. His money had finally run out. Not just the cash in his pockets, but the quiet financial safety net his mother had always provided. She had called him 3 days earlier, her voice tired in a way he had never heard before. "Emmanuel, I can't keep doing this," she had said, her words slow, measured, as if choosing them carefully. "You said this was for school, for your future, but you keep asking, and I keep giving, and I don't even know what's happening anymore." He had responded the way he always did, with irritation, with denial, with another lie. But this time, she hadn't believed him. "I went to your school, Emmanuel," she had whispered, her voice shaking. "I spoke to your department. They said you haven't been to class in over a year." The silence that followed was deafening. Emmanuel had felt something in his stomach drop, but he recovered quickly, scoffing, calling her misinformed, telling her she didn't understand how things worked. But she hadn't argued. She had only sighed, a long, broken sound, and ended the call. And that was when he knew. The game was over. His mother, the one person who had always shielded him from reality, had finally seen through him. And with that shield gone, he had nothing left to hide behind. The full weight of his deception crashed down on him, suffocating him. He had spent years believing he could cheat life, that he could take and take without ever giving, that consequences were for people weaker than him. But now, as he sat in his dimly lit room, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror, he saw himself clearly for the first time. He was not powerful. He was not untouchable. He was a boy drowning in the wreckage of his own making, and there was no one left to save him. Desperation crept in quickly after that. Without money, without influence, without the false security of his fraternity brothers, Emmanuel found himself spiraling. He avoided his usual hangouts, ignored messages, skipped gatherings. He could feel the walls closing in, and he knew he had little time before they crushed him completely. One night, after hours of pacing his small, suffocating room, he made a decision, the only one that seemed to make sense. He needed money. Fast. And there was only one way left to get it. It was almost laughable how low he had fallen, how quickly the empire he had built had crumbled. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was survival. And so, with shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had sworn he would never call. The voice on the other end was calm, familiar, laced with quiet amusement. "So, you finally came to your senses," the man said. "I was wondering when you'd break." Emmanuel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had stepped onto this path long ago, and now there was no turning back. The night was unbearably silent as Emmanuel made his way through the dimly lit back streets, his footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. The weight of his decision pressed against his chest, but he forced himself to keep moving. There was no room for hesitation anymore. He had crossed the point where choices existed. This was now survival. The number he had dialed earlier still lingered in his call history, mocking him, a stark reminder of how low he had sunk. He had promised himself, promised his mother, even that he would never get involved with these kinds of men. But here he was, walking toward the very thing he had once looked down on. The man he was meeting was not a friend. He was not a mentor. He was a fixer, a problem solver for people who had run out of options. And tonight Emmanuel was just another desperate man in need of a lifeline. He arrived at the rundown building on the outskirts of town, its flickering fluorescent light casting eerie shadows along the entrance. A heavy-set man stood at the door, his arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Without a word, he stepped aside, letting Emmanuel through. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale smoke and something else, something metallic, something wrong. He ignored it, focusing instead on the man seated at the far end of the room, his fingers lazily tapping against a half-empty glass of whiskey. "You took your time," the man said without looking up. His voice was smooth, detached, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Emmanuel swallowed hard before stepping forward. Sitting across from the man, Emmanuel forced himself to appear calm, though his hands trembled beneath the table. The fixer, known simply as Dyke, studied him with quiet amusement, as if reading every desperate thought running through his head. "You are out of money, out of favors, out of luck," Dyke mused, taking a slow sip of his drink. "And now you're here." The words were spoken casually, but their weight was crushing. Emmanuel hated how transparent he had become, how easy it was for someone like Dyke to see through him. But there was no point in denying it. "I need work," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Dyke chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you need money. There's a difference." He leaned back, watching Emmanuel with an almost bored expression. "And people who need money are willing to do things they wouldn't have considered before. Isn't that right?" Emmanuel's stomach twisted, but he didn't look away. He had known this wouldn't be simple. Nothing in his life had ever come without a cost. Dyke tapped a finger against the table, as if considering his options. "There's something you can do," he finally said. "Simple job. Quick, but it requires a certain level of commitment." Emmanuel didn't ask questions. He couldn't afford to. He just nodded. Dyke smirked, pushing a small envelope across the table. "Instructions are inside. You have 24 hours. Emmanuel picked up the envelope, the paper feeling heavier than it should have. Dyke's expression darkened slightly. "This is your last chance, boy. If you mess this up, don't come back." The warning was clear, but Emmanuel barely registered it. He had already made his choice. He had stepped into the fire, and there was no escaping the burn. Back in his small, suffocating room, Emmanuel stared at the envelope for what felt like hours. His hands rested on either side of it, unwilling to tear it open, yet unable to push it away. He knew the moment he read what was inside, there would be no turning back. The life he had known, even the broken, ruined version of it, would cease to exist. But the alternative was worse. A life with nothing, a future with nothing. That, more than anything, terrified him. Finally, with a deep breath, he ripped the envelope open. Inside was a single piece of paper, the instructions written in neat, almost elegant handwriting. The job itself was simple, just as Dyke had promised, but the simplicity of it was what made it horrifying. He was to deliver a package, nothing more, nothing less. But the address scrawled at the bottom sent a cold chill down his spine. It was an area known for its silence, where people saw nothing, heard nothing, and asked no questions. Emmanuel clenched his jaw, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip. He had made his bed. Now he had to lie in it. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over his mother's number before he stopped himself. What would he even say? That her son, the one she had fought so hard to protect, was now running errands for men who operated in the shadows? That he had failed in every way imaginable? No, there was nothing left to say. So instead, he shoved the paper into his pocket, grabbed his jacket, and walked out the door. The night swallowed him whole, and as he disappeared into the darkness, one thought echoed in his mind. The weight of the package in Emmanuel's hand felt heavier than it should have. It was small, wrapped tightly in brown paper, and sealed with tape that had the faint scent of something chemical. He didn't need to open it to know that whatever was inside was dangerous. Men like Dyke didn't deal in harmless deliveries. The air was thick with humidity as he walked through the deserted streets, his fingers tightening around the edges of the parcel. It was late, past midnight, and the city had taken on a different kind of silence, the eerie kind, where every shadow seemed to move, where every distant sound made his heart pound just a little harder. He had memorized the address, forcing the numbers into his brain as if knowing them by heart would make this feel like something he had chosen rather than something he had been forced into. The farther he walked, the fewer streetlights there were, until he was moving under the dim glow of scattered bulbs, some flickering like they were on the verge of dying out. He was nearing the part of town where questions led to consequences, where wrong turns could mean never making it home. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but his feet kept moving forward. The promise of money, of stability, even if it was fleeting, was the only thing keeping him upright. He had never felt this level of desperation before, and it scared him how quickly he was willing to cross lines he once thought untouchable. When he reached the address, it was exactly what he expected. A narrow, run-down building with no visible signs of life, except for the dull glow of a single bulb above the doorway. The door itself was slightly ajar, an invitation or a warning. He couldn't tell which. Emmanuel hesitated, his breath unsteady as he reached for the handle. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust, damp wood, and something metallic that made his stomach twist. A single figure sat at a wooden table in the dimly lit room, his face shadowed beneath the flickering light. He didn't look up as Emmanuel stepped inside, as if he had been expecting him. "You have it?" the man asked, his voice rough, low. Emmanuel nodded and placed the package on the table, stepping back quickly, as if creating distance could somehow erase his involvement. The man finally looked up, his eyes sharp, calculating. He unwrapped the package slowly, carefully, and as soon as the contents were revealed, Emmanuel felt the blood drain from his face. He had suspected drugs, maybe money, something illegal but predictable. But what lay inside was worse. A small pistol, gleaming under the dim light, and a single envelope thick with cash. Emmanuel's throat went dry. He had just transported a gun. Not a parcel, not some meaningless contraband, but a weapon, one that would undoubtedly be used for something violent. He wanted to leave, to pretend he had never set foot in this place, but the man was watching him now, his fingers tracing the handle of the gun. "Dyke says you're useful," he murmured, as if testing the weight of the words. "I hope he's right." Emmanuel didn't respond. He turned and walked out, each step feeling like he was sinking deeper into something he could never escape. The night air hit him like a wave, but it did nothing to ease the nausea churning in his stomach. He had told himself this was just about money, about survival, but this wasn't survival anymore. This was something darker, something irreversible. He knew what happened to men who got involved in things like this. They didn't walk away. They either got pulled deeper or they disappeared. As he made his way back to his apartment, his mind raced with thoughts of what came next. He could take the money, pretend this was a one-time thing, convince himself that he still had control over his life. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no such thing as one last job. Dyke had tested him tonight, and now that he had passed, there would be more. More deliveries, more silence, more lines he never intended to cross. His hands felt dirty, even though he had touched nothing but the package. When he finally reached his room, he locked the door and sank onto the bed, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He had started this journey thinking he was invincible, that the world owed him something. Now, for the first time, he realized he had never been in control. And worse, he was no longer sure if he ever wanted to be. The weight of what Emmanuel had done settled into his bones, a heaviness that refused to leave. He had spent the past few days locked inside his tiny apartment, the money from the delivery still untouched on the table, mocking him with every glance. He should have felt relief. After all, he had done what was asked of him and had been paid handsomely for it. But instead of satisfaction, all he felt was dread. His phone had been ringing constantly, different numbers flashing across the screen, but he never answered. He knew who it was. Dyke, the man who had pulled him into this world, who had tested him and found him useful. Emmanuel wanted to pretend that he could disappear, that if he ignored those calls long enough, Dyke would move on to someone else. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The kind of men he was dealing with didn't forget. They didn't let go. He had accepted their money, followed their instructions. That made him one of them now, whether he wanted to be or not. Every sound outside his door made his pulse quicken. Every knock sent his mind into overdrive. He started sleeping with the lights on, his body too tense to relax even when exhaustion threatened to consume him. The paranoia was suffocating, yet he knew it wasn't unfounded. He had crossed a line, and there was no erasing it. On the third day, just as he convinced himself that maybe they had given up on him, the knocking came. Not the tentative knock of a visitor, but a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent ice through his veins. He sat frozen, his breath shallow, hoping that if he stayed quiet, whoever was outside would leave. But then came the voice, calm, measured, laced with quiet authority. "Open the door, Emmanuel." Dyke. The moment stretched, every second feeling like an eternity, until finally Emmanuel forced himself to stand. His legs felt unsteady as he reached for the handle, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned it. The door swung open to reveal Dyke standing there, flanked by two men Emmanuel had never seen before. Their expressions were unreadable, their presence suffocating. Without a word, Dyke stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on the untouched money on the table. A smirk tugged at his lips. "You haven't spent it," he observed, picking up the envelope and tossing it back down. "That's good. Means you understand what this really is." Emmanuel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I can't do this," he finally forced out. Dyke chuckled, shaking his head. "You already did, boy. And now, we need you again." The finality in his tone made it clear that refusal was not an option. Dyke took a step closer, lowering his voice. "We all have choices, Emmanuel, but the problem is, once you've chosen, you don't get to undo it. You think you can just walk away? That's not how this works." A chill ran down Emmanuel's spine as the reality of his situation sank in. He had made the mistake of believing that this was just a job, a way to make quick money and then move on. But it was never that simple. The moment he delivered that package, he had become a part of something much larger than himself, something that didn't allow loose ends. Dyke leaned in, his voice almost gentle now. "You're smart enough to know that running isn't an option. So I'll make this easy for you. Another job. Just one. And then we'll talk about what comes next." The way he said it sent a wave of nausea through Emmanuel. Another job meant another line crossed, another layer of himself stripped away. But refusing wasn't an option. Not anymore. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he forced himself to nod. Dyke's smirk widened. "Good. I knew you'd come around." He gestured to one of the men behind him, who stepped forward and handed Emmanuel another envelope. "Instructions are inside," Dyke said, already turning toward the door. "Don't keep us waiting this time." And just like that, they were gone, leaving Emmanuel standing there, his world collapsing around him. He looked down at the envelope in his hands, his breath shaky. He had thought regret was the worst thing he could feel. But now, as the walls closed in on him, he realized that fear was much worse. The weight of the envelope in Emmanuel's hands felt heavier than before, as if it carried not just another task, but the confirmation that he was sinking deeper into a life he could no longer recognize. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the sealed paper, his fingers hesitating over the fold. He knew that inside lay another job, another step into the abyss. But what truly terrified him wasn't the task itself, it was how easily he had accepted that there was no way out. He thought about the boy he had once been, the one who had walked into university full of arrogance, convinced that the world owed him something. That boy had been reckless, foolish, but at least he had believed he had choices. Now, sitting in the dim light of his room, he realized how little control he had ever truly possessed. With a deep, shuddering breath, he tore open the envelope. The note inside was written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting as before. The instructions were clear. He was to meet someone at a quiet, unmarked location on the outskirts of town. There were no details on what he was picking up or delivering this time, only a time, a place, and a warning, come alone. No mistakes. His stomach twisted as he read the words over and over again. Every part of him screamed that this was different, that this was a test far more dangerous than the last. But hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had seen the look in Dyke's eyes the last time they spoke. There was no space for second chances, no room for disobedience. The night air was thick and stifling as Emmanuel walked the lonely road toward the meeting point. The farther he moved from the city, the quieter everything became, until the only sound was the gravel crunching beneath his feet. The location was an abandoned warehouse, its metal walls rusted from years of neglect. A single car sat parked just outside, its headlights off, its presence like a ghost waiting in the dark. He approached cautiously, his pulse hammering with each step. As he reached the car, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, one Emmanuel had never seen before. He was older, his face sharp with experience, his eyes carrying the kind of weight that came from knowing too much. "You're the kid?" the man asked, his voice calm, almost amused. Emmanuel nodded stiffly, forcing himself to stand still even as his instincts screamed at him to run. The man studied him for a moment before nodding toward the trunk. "Open it." Emmanuel hesitated for only a second before moving. His fingers felt clumsy against the latch, but when the trunk finally lifted, he nearly staggered back. Inside, bound and gagged, was a man, his face bloodied, his eyes wild with fear. Emmanuel's breath caught in his throat as he turned back to the man standing beside him. "What is this?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The man only smiled, pulling a small pistol from his jacket and pressing it into Emmanuel's hand. "Your real initiation," he said simply. "No more errands, no more small jobs. You want to be part of this? Then prove it." The world around Emmanuel blurred as he stared at the gun, his fingers trembling against the cold metal. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had been desperate for money, for survival, not for this, not to become a murderer. But as his breath came in ragged bursts, reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. There was no getting out of this. He had stepped too far into the shadows, and now they had swallowed him whole. He looked down at the man in the trunk, his muffled pleas filling the silence, his eyes begging for mercy. And in that moment Emmanuel saw himself not as he was now, but as he had been before all of this. Before the bad choices, before the arrogance, before the desperation. A boy who had everything but had thrown it all away. He had spent years believing he could take and take without consequence, but now, standing at the edge of something he could never undo, he understood the truth. This was the consequence. His fingers tightened around the gun. The man beside him waited, his expression expectant. Emmanuel knew that whatever happened next would define the rest of his life. He could pull the trigger and seal his fate, or refuse and face the wrath of men who did not tolerate failure. He took a slow, shuddering breath, his heartbeat deafening in his ears. And then, in a single, decisive moment, he made his choice. A choice that would change everything. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.